Yeah. Okay. Well, I understand you've done a lot of work on this, and but you are working for the super funds. Is that right?
No. I undertook a project for the Super Members Council,
Was that
which
a
they paid for.
paid project?
Yes, that was a paid project.
Yeah.
But let me say, I wouldn't have undertaken that work if I hadn't been of the views that I expressed in the paper that I wrote.
I assume that's why they wanted to pay you to do it.
Well, that may well be so. That may well be so. But what I'd also note is that, for example, I have publicly opposed the increase in compulsory SGC rates, which the superannuation industry and in particular the Super Members Council have advocated for. Yeah. So in no sense would it be fair to describe me as a spokesperson, paid or otherwise, for the superannuation industry or any of its constituents.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But they do have deep pockets, so I hope they looked after you in that regard. I would say that home ownership, though, is an important part of retirement, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Our retirement system has long had as one of its unstated assumptions that the vast majority of people would have close to zero housing costs in retirement because either they would own their own homes outright and thus would only have to carry municipal rates and repairs and maintenance costs as part of their housing costs, or for the relatively small proportion historically of Australians who haven't been able to achieve home ownership by the time they reach retirement, they'd be housed in social housing where rents were fixed as a relatively low proportion of their relatively low incomes. That assumption is still largely true at the moment, but given the very rapid declines in home ownership rates among people who are 55 or under, and even more so the decline in the proportion of people who reach their 50s and ultimately the normal retirement age without having paid off their mortgage, that assumption is going to become increasingly invalid.
Well, I mean,
so we do have a problem on that front.
As you know, I mean, the ABS say that 32% of the lump sums that came out of super last year were used to pay off mortgages. So,
indeed.
So that's a problem.
And that's rational from the standpoint of people who find themselves in that position, reaching retirement while still having outstanding mortgage debt. It's entirely rational for them to pay off their mortgage, but it runs contrary to the intention of the superannuation system.
Well, these things can be changed by Parliament, as you know. But as you know, the Super Members Council is doing its best to ensure that a future Parliament does not make those changes, which is why they commission you to do this piece of work, I imagine, because they know about your views and they know that you are happy to help them. Did you conduct any new modelling for the Super Members Council report?
No, I didn't.
So what about the assumptions in the report? Where did they come from?
Well, they made assumptions about increases in house prices, which I referred to but did not use in my analysis. So all I said was that the weight of historical evidence was that, as with anything else that allows people to spend more on housing than they'd otherwise be able to, allowing people to withdraw funds from their accumulated superannuation accounts would result in more expensive housing. And I quoted a range of estimates, including not just those of the Super Members Council modelers themselves, but also of the Grattan Institute and a couple of other people.
Okay.
But how much house prices would rise was not particularly germane to the findings I reached. I did rely on modelling by Super Members Council on things like the median superannuation balance, the proportion of people in different age groups who would be able to withdraw the maximum amount under the scheme that your colleagues are proposing, and things like that. But it wasn't crucial to the analysis or the report which I wrote how much house prices were likely to rise.
Okay, so SMC provided some of the inputs.
Yes, and they were disclosed in, as they should be in such things, in the footnotes to the various tables.
Okay, and are you able to provide those assumptions?
Yes, I can. If you like, I can send to the Secretary a copy of the report which I wrote, and all the assumptions in it were disclosed. The report's also on my website if anyone wants to access it that way. It's in no way a secret document, but I can certainly send it to the Secretariat of this committee if that's your wish.
Yes, please. And did Deloitte provide any input as well?
Not to me directly, but I referred to a report which they have published, a public report, estimating the cost to the budget over an extended period as a result of encouraging a shift in savings from a form which is taxed, albeit concessionally, namely superannuation, to a form which is not taxed at all, namely owner-occupied housing. So they undertook some estimates of that, which I quoted and noted where they were sourced from.
Yeah. Did you go through a process to check whether your work was actually closely reflecting the coalition's policy, or were you undertaking a different task?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question, Senator, but I quoted the coalition's policy at some length in the introduction to that part of the report. I think I quoted some statements of yours in a couple of instances, and I quoted from a number of supporters of the scheme to outline what I understood it to be and what I understood that its supporters believed its benefits would be, in order to be as fair as I possibly could.
Yeah, so just so I understand, so your view is that the super for housing idea is bad, but that there shouldn't be a higher super guarantee rate?
Yes.
Okay, because you think there's too much.
And I mentioned that explicitly, Senator, just in case anyone is inclined to think that I am a spokesperson for the superannuation industry and that I would say anything that they wanted me to say. There are instances where I agree with them. There are instances where I don't. I think it's fair to say, as you did, that they wouldn't have asked me to undertake this particular piece of work if they thought it was likely that I would say that the scheme was a good idea. I think that's kind of pretty obvious. But nonetheless, they made no attempt to dictate what I would or wouldn't say in that report. And people who know me well know that no one ever tells me what I can or can't say. I've resigned from organisations where management has tried to do that.
Yeah, I understand that, but the reason I'm asking you these perhaps annoying questions is because they're trying to influence a significant public debate. So I guess I'm just wondering whether there's anything else you could tell us about this report, how much it cost, whether you provided them with a draft before it was published, those sort of things.
Well, yeah, I don't regard your questions as annoying at all, Senator. They're perfectly fine. I suspect it's a matter for them to disclose how much they paid. If they want to, they can. I'm not sure that it's appropriate for me to disclose how much I charge my clients for undertaking various pieces of work. But if they choose to, that's a matter for them. Yes, I provided them with a draft report before it was finalised. That was partly to let them know how things were going. They made some suggestions as to things that they would or would not like to have seen in it. I accepted some of those suggestions and rejected others, but in every case, the decision as to what was in the report and what wasn't was mine and mine alone.
Okay, well, if you could just take on notice the question about how much you're paid for the report, we would be grateful. And finally, because I want to give the call now to Senator Pocock, I'm fascinated by your evidence that you think the super guarantee is too high. Is that because you think...
No, sorry, no, Senator, let me be clear about that. What I was opposed to was increasing it from the level at which it had been around 2015, 2014. As I recall, the Rudd-Gillard government had proposed increases in it, and the Abbott government put those off for a couple of years. And then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere around 2016, 2017, legislation was passed authorising increases in it from about 2022, if I recall correctly. It was those increases in the SGC rate which I was opposed to.
Why do you oppose those?
On the grounds that for most people, 10%, or whatever the contribution rate was at the time, was sufficient to provide an adequate income in retirement. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone, in particular women who are more likely to have interrupted careers, may not require, for the period that they are in paid employment, the then maximum rate or the then required rate under SGC might not have given them an adequate income in retirement, but there are other ways of dealing with those issues, including, as I think is now legislated, the government making payments to women in particular who have periods out of the workforce where they're caring for children or other relatives. And I think that's a more effective way of dealing with that problem than increasing the overall SGC rate.
Okay, sounds like a good argument for super for housing, but with that I'll go to Senator